Australia Post has been delivering across this wide brown land for generations. But the tale of this country began with the original storytellers long, long ago. For 65,000 years, this continent has been home to hundreds of nations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They are the custodians of the land, water and sky that surrounds us, with a connection to country that has never waned. For millennia, they have passed down language, culture and traditions through song, dance and story, connecting the past with the future. Today, we pay respect to elders past, present and future and recognise the contribution of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We hear their voice and look to work towards a more reconciled future. Together, we learn and share the story of this country.
Thank you for joining us today for our Business Talks webinar. I'm Gary Starr, Executive General Manager at Australia Post, and I'm thrilled to host today's webinar. Now, before we kick off, I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, the First Nation custodians of the country I live on, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to the ongoing living culture of the First Nations people. Now, on to our webinar. For those who haven't joined us before, our Business Talk series is geared towards supporting our customers on their own business journeys by engaging dynamic guests who have experiences to share or insights into current and future economic trends. We have a great lineup of guests for you today. We'll look at the global economic landscape right now and what the next year might hold. We will hear from an Australian brand that has gone from strength to strength despite the global pandemic. And I'll have a chat with an interesting small business that is breaking into overseas markets. I am sure that this session will provide some timely food for thought as we all gear up for the peak shopping period. First up, it's a great pleasure to be speaking with David Mann, Chief Economist, Asia Pacific at MasterCard. And I'm really keen to hear what David has to say about the current business environment we are operating in and his forecasts for 2025. David, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Gary. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And maybe the first few minutes, if I may, I'll just sort of outline, as you say, a few of our thoughts of what's going on, and then happy to go into the conversation. The first point I would point out is that the Economics Institute that I'm in at MasterCard is a group within the services division that looks to try and create the better, smarter outcomes for our clients, leveraging the data that we have, but also the external sort of data that we're able to get on the usual stories that economists would all be looking for. And the big story that we think is going on today is that globally, as well as in Australia, we are finishing off at last what has been an extremely drawn out bungee jump for the global economy. If I show you all the way back to the year 1900, you can see GDP growth globally in red, with the shaded in areas in gray representing recessions: World War II, the Great Depression, the 1980s recession, the dot-com boom and bust, the global financial crisis through 2008, and then, of course, the COVID pandemic, where we had this biggest collapse in global GDP growth in 75 years. Now, that sort of extreme move down to then go from closed and then we went right back again to being reopened was so extreme that the ripple effects have still been impacting us all the way through to today. So the long story short, we would stress on what's going on today is that we have already gone through an extreme period of stress. We are at the peak period, I would argue, also of stress for households in Australia, given the high levels of interest rates that the majority of those with a mortgage are feeling today because of that lagged effect from the fixed rates mortgages that so many people had had before. But these extreme moves where we used to have such low inflation, and then we had a burst of higher inflation. We used to have extremely low migration. We've had a burst of inward migration. And it's been the same story in the labor market, with the same story with interest rates swinging from ultra low to so high. These dramatic shifts are now finally coming towards something that is settling down a little bit. And I think that's the good news that we can really be zooming in on, which is that while it's been very disorientating, just like with a bungee jump, once you've had that bounce, You lose orientation of where the ground is and the sky is. What should your expectations be over the next few years should not be influenced too much, in our view, by what's been happening over the last few years, mainly because it was just not normal. Now, the more normal period we think is what we're going into in 2025 and beyond. And in that regard, when we think about the rebalancing, the first thing that I would stress is that we had already seen GDP growth, as I show you on the far left-hand side with that big jump lower, the bungee jump swinging back higher again. We've been settling down more towards trend growth. For consumption expenditure, which is the PCE chart, the second one in here, similar story of the collapse, aggressive rebound, and then swinging around quite dramatically. Of course, fiscal policy and other things can play a role in here, as has the role of excess savings that accumulated during the pandemic. And of course, with inflation, we had a similar kind of pattern where we had the collapse and then a huge boom in inflation. It's been settling down, but unlike PCE or GDP, you can see we've not yet really gone back to where we think the long run numbers should be. It's been that little bit more sticky. And that, in our view, of course, helps to explain while in the case of the United States, we are seeing and likely to get some interest rate cuts coming, and it will be a continuous cycle. We think by September of this year, it'll be a later period, likely in the early parts of 2025, before we see the same thing coming from the RBA. And of all the key reasons behind it has been the ultra tight labor market. Wage growth accelerated up beyond 4%, even through the middle of last year. And we already are seeing it easing off a little bit, but I would stress, and happy to talk maybe more about it in the conversation, that the labor market is going from extremely tight levels to just less tight. And that will be the key driver, really, we think, for the RBA, is how much calmer the wage growth story can become to give them that room to be starting to cut interest rates. But of course, it does help that we think the US will already get going. In Europe, it's already underway. And that lowering of interest rates should be the very good news that we think will be coming in 2025 by later in the year, as the pressure on consumers that has gone through these surges in the cost of living in the last few years, and really also the cost of financing a mortgage, will start to see at least some relief. So some dip down towards where we had been previously on inflation, we think is on the way. So calmer inflation and calmer wage growth, which will give enough room for those interest rate cuts to actually come along. Now, when we think about what all of that means for the actual growth trend for next year, when we've looked into the forecast, say, for real GDP growth or just for, say, consumption expenditure, we think the peak of the pain is actually what we've been going through and are going through today. The low point we have for overall expenditure in Australia's economy is actually in the fourth quarter, we think, and then we'll be getting that much better through the rest of this year and into next year. So we're re-accelerating. And I think that's the positive side. And of course, the key driver also will be that lowering of inflation back towards the RBA's main objective. So those are the key things that I just wanted to stress at the opening. That it should be, we would say, for how we're going to be doing in this peak season, that we think, see something similar to last year, though the key difference will most likely be that in the November sales periods, that bargain hunting that consumers have because of the rise in the cost of living may be even more aggressively seen, and therefore even more so in the online space than the offline space. But as I stressed, we're not looking for a recession. If there is any risk of slightly softer growth, that is the direction where I would say the risk is, rather than even stronger than expected figures. And of course, that resilience of the consumer has at least partially also been supported by the tight labor market and the large rises that we had been seeing in net inward migration. So maybe I'll pause at this point and happy to go into a discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Some great insights there and a great sort of macro view of what's happening both globally, but here in Australia. And there are a few paradoxes there. I mean, you talked the oscillating consumption, and obviously all interrelated, but with unemployment and then CPI and inflation. So if interest rates won't ease until you're talking the calendar quarter one of next year, so the sort of after Christmas, after the peak period. Is there any more you can share? So, and our forecasting suggests a similar sort of peak period to last year. But anything else you can talk to around the peak period, just in terms of, because consumer sentiment plays a big role here, and without interest rate cuts, will consumers still spend through that October to sort of Christmas period?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the way that we're thinking about this also, in that what we believe is going to be the story is that we're going to have some sort of similar period to last year, but the jump that we should be seeing, particularly during the sales periods, let's say around the sort of Black Friday, Cyber Monday, because we think consumers are even more focused on those good deals. It is something we did see in the years gone by, increasingly one year to the next. And we think that will still be the story, that you get that really big surge, you get that extreme amounts of even bottlenecking of just how much consumers want to spend when they see the good deals. And we think that should be the story for this year. The other thing that we think, it might be slightly early to see it just now, but we think will probably be more of a story in next year, will actually be when we get to the stage where we see some more of the desire for some replacement of some of the, I would say, physical goods. Because what we noticed in the last few years, if we go back to, say, 21 and 2022, when the household goods demand was so strong, in the last year or so in particular, we have actually seen the share of wallet being spent in particular on, say, the retail therapy rather than the experiences, say the dining or the travel. We've seen a lot more of the spending going on that rather than retail therapy. We think that will start to rebalance a bit more towards the sort of ratios that you would have seen in the pre-pandemic period, partly just because of a replacement cycle. And also there is an ongoing, still, I would say, underperformance of prices when it comes to electronic goods. We still have that story, and in particular with the story from China being of exporting lower inflation around the world, that should also be adding to that story to at least some degree. So it could be even in this season, there's a slightly better demand on the electronics side than there had been in years gone by. But we think that probably is even more of a story for 2025 as the replacement cycle gets a little bit more underway. The other thing that should be helping through next year, more likely also, will be that with those rate cuts, that could also give a little bit more life to the housing market, provide a little bit more of the activity there, which could mean even more of the demand for the usual sorts of household goods that come alongside when people are moving around. And so more activity in that area alongside electronics, we think, is what we're likely to see next year. Also, in terms of growth rates, there is a limit to just how far we can go on the travel recovery that already has been so strong in the last few years since the reopening. We're getting towards the point of saturation there. And of course, the price rises had been quite strong. The key thing we think for consumers, and we'll be watching it in this season, will also be to what extent are we going to see the more affluent consumers still outperforming, while the lower income consumers that have been feeling even more of the pressure from the cost of living, from essentials expenditure and the share of spending, say, on groceries and fuel being that much higher, will we see some of that start to also correct where we see a bit more of a broader strength? And we think, again, that's probably more of a 2025 story with the rate cuts coming as well. The key thing also that I should stress is that we've been quite lucky so far on the inflation front from the fact that commodity prices have been pretty well behaved, in that we've not seen any aggressive spike in, say, crude oil prices. The ultimate cliche for any economist is to talk about oil prices and the impact that you would get if you had a major spike. And we've not yet had that, even with all of this litany of concerns that you could be raising on the geopolitical front. Doesn't mean it can never happen, but it is a factor to watch for. But so far, fortunately, that has not been the case.
Right, and just to take that a bit further, I mean, you talked about some areas of consumption, but are you? We saw massive growth in home and garden through COVID, obviously, because people were at home. And you talk about electronics, and then building obviously stimulates a purchase for the home. But so you do expect that to? Are you saying you expect that to bounce back as we see quite a lot of initiative around building, but also people start to be more confident and interest rates come down, that category will start to grow?
Yeah, I think it could be a bit premature to call for it to be strong immediately. We think it probably is more like a 2025 story where that should be doing that much better, we think, for all the reasons that you suggested. The other key thing that we'll be watching for, of course, will be on the overall labor market, but also the state of migration. because the key thing that has really been helping out a lot of retailers and keeping a lot of the activity much stronger than it would have been otherwise has actually been the rise in the population overall because of the migration trend, where we saw a surge in migration through 2023 and in 2024 as well, before starting to ease off. Now, that has really helped us to avoid an overall recession in GDP, as well as on consumer spending. So at the aggregate level, we still have something that's positive, but on a per person basis, it's actually been negative for a while. So there's already been this, I think, reflection of the pain taken by the rise in the cost of living in per person consumer spending. The key question for us is, now that we have less on the migration trend, that you won't be seeing that growth as strong as it has been over the last year or two in net 2025, but we will see some relief coming from the RBA. That's why we're a bit balanced on exactly where the growth will be. We think slightly better, but very marginally. I would say, as you're saying with your forecast, we would agree that it's a similar story to what we saw last year, rather than it being a recession. And I think that's the key thing, that I think too many times in the last few years, because of how disorientating everything has been with ultra high interest rates, high inflation, a lot of folks have been panicking, I think, prematurely over an actual recession, particularly somewhere like the US, where 2023 was meant to have been a recession, and it turned out to be an above trend growth year. And I think this resilience partly comes from the labor market, but also comes from migration and from the excess savings that had accumulated during the pandemic. In Australia's case now, savings rates has actually gone below where it is normally. And therefore, we're starting to see some using up of some of these excess savings, folks digging into some of that. And that buffer that's there is the extra, I would think, benefit that really is helping us to avoid what otherwise would have been a more painful period already.
So that's really interesting, and I guess it's for all those online to think through just what that means in terms of the next 6 to 12 months. If I could turn now to international markets, in 2022 to 23, we saw a doubling of merchants selling overseas. That's somewhat tightened this year, but there's obviously many of the people listening today do already sell overseas or be contemplating that. And you've spoken about interest rates being low, its exchange rate being lower, I should say. But how do you see international markets and the opportunities for Australian businesses selling to the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating question, because when we think about where global growth actually comes from, I just started sharing my screen again, but I'll talk to it for those who may or may not be able to see it. Actually, Australia being in this part of the world in the Asia Pacific region is one where it's closest to the fastest growing markets, where the rising middle class story emerging from being an emerging market to middle income and then even eventually higher income. Most places around the world that are seeing that are either in Eastern Europe or in Asia Pacific. And I think the Asia Pacific story, even including China, where we think next year will be growing around 4%, maybe 4.5%, which is half what it used to be 15 to 20 years ago, will still be adding a serious amount of contribution to overall growth. But it's not just the China story that, even though it's weaker than it used to be, it still is a major factor. The other key markets that I think are at least worth looking into and considering are, of course, India, where if we can see 7% real GDP growth, which is actually our forecast for next year, if that can become the trend, then India's economy can double every 10 years when it compounds at that sort of rate. And we are already likely to see an extra 5 million high-income consumers in India in the next 5 years, and 20 million middle-income consumers being added to that economy. So it has that sort of population scale. It's now a more populous nation even than China, and it has that growth rate. So the momentum, as you can see from the contributions that we look at to global GDP growth, coming from India, from China, but also coming from the ASEAN region itself, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore. These are economies we think that also still have a very strong contribution to where global growth and therefore demand, if you're looking outside of Australia, where will the growth delta be coming from? Many of the places are down in South or Southeast Asia. And I think that is another interesting thing, separate to the usual suspects of, say, Eastern Europe or the UK or the US, much further afield, I would say, much more of a logistical challenge compared to some of the more, I would say, closer by, quote unquote, locations. So I think that's the good news, in that it's a good economic neighborhood to be in. So for those focused internationally, I think South and Southeast Asia looks like a good one to focus on if it makes sense for your business.
And that's really interesting, David, because as you know, our major export markets are New Zealand, the UK, and the US. So opportunity in those as those markets grow, the middle class grows and GDP growth, some of those consistent GDP growth do represent opportunities in those markets that are sort of consumption markets. That's really interesting.
Yeah, path less trodden, I would say. Yeah, that's right. I think
path less
that's
trodden. And what
exciting part for the future.
That's exactly right. So it's good food for thought for those listening today. And what does the exchange rate have an impact? Because a lot of exporters have enjoyed the benefit of a slightly weaker Australian dollar. It's been sustained for a period, but I assume that will strengthen in the next little while, as per what you discussed earlier.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. That if we're finally now getting to the state where we're going to be seeing US interest rate cuts, and it's starting a lot earlier than we'll see in Australia, and we think it will continue all the way through 2025, that should also mark finally the end of dollar strength. It's not immediate. We don't think it's from today onwards necessarily, but I think we've already clearly seen a lot of those signs, especially since the ultra aggressive turnaround from being so weak to being a bit less weak in the Japanese yen. It's about 10% stronger than it was even when we took some of the observations just a few weeks ago on where the exchange rates had been moving. So in Australia's case, actually, if we go back since the beginning of 2022, we can actually see that certainly the Aussie dollar against the yen is still about 20% stronger. There's a few markets out there, Korean won and India, even including the Kiwi dollar, where the Aussie dollar is doing better. But those ones that it had been a bit behind on, we think there could be a little bit of a turnaround coming in that regard. In particular, against the US dollar, it's still about 8% down compared to where it had been in 2022. So we think next year we could be breaking that bit higher into the 70s for the Aussie dollar. Of course, that means when it comes to selling internationally, the competitive side may not be so good, but the purchasing power for Australian consumers and businesses to be buying from abroad should also be helped. And that slightly stronger Aussie dollar as well should also be an added reason why the RBA could be a bit more comfortable on the rate cutting cycle too.
Great. So look, thank you, David. That's really interesting. And as I said, great food for thought for those who are already selling overseas, but those who are considering doing it. And look, we are just out of time, unfortunately. I have so many more questions, but we're out of time. So thank you so much for joining us today. I think your perspective have given us a valuable insight and a lot to consider.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, David. Okay, well, next up, we'll hear about a rapidly growing Australian business who has managed to thrive despite launching their business just before the global pandemic hit. Our General Manager of Enterprise and Government, Andrew Brickwood, sat down with the co-founder of July Luggage to explore the secrets behind their success.
I'm Andrew Brickwood, the General Manager of Enterprise and Government here at Australia Post, and I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Lee, co-founder and CEO of July Luggage, an amazing Australian story and really taking the global market by storm. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm very happy to be here today.
So I know the audience is really looking forward to hearing more about agility in business, customer experience, expanding into new markets, and it's that time of the year nearly upon us, so thinking about peak and the impacts of peak. But before we get started, it'd be great to hear some more about the brand.
For sure. July is a premium direct-to-consumer luggage and bags brand. We first started in Melbourne, and now we are fully operating in US, UK, and Australia. And our mission is to help people travel better with high-quality designer travel products. That's the brand.
So look, it'd be great to kick off, if we think about agility, really understanding agility in the context of your leadership at July Luggage.
For sure. I think agility in my company means, being able to, change quickly to the market dynamics, and also make sure that we can unite the team together to work on the most fundamental things in the business towards one goal. For leaders like ourselves in the company is to make sure that we clear the roadblocks for them so that they can have the freedom and focus to work on those things.
Thinking about starting in 2019, thinking about launching a luggage brand, a fantastic luggage brand, and then COVID shutting down the world, overnight, and global travel just stopped.
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden there were just no planes on the flight aware apps and so on. So I just imagine that would have been an amazing time of agility. So if you could talk to us and tell us about how did you actually go through that period of time?
So 2019, we launched the business. We had a stellar year. We were growing like crazy. We were like, hitting all our goals. We launched our first retail store in Emporium Shopping Center. We also raised a first round of capital. It was crazy. We thought that we were unstoppable until early 2020, and everything stopped. We had a huge decline in revenue. We didn't know what to do. And it was at that time we made some decisions. The first one we did was we wanted to focus on diversifying our product range, our product offering. So we got a team to focus on product development rather than chasing revenue because we couldn't. No one was traveling. And the second thing that we did was that, we were looking at, okay, if Australia was in lockdown, is there another market where there wasn't lockdown? We saw China was still flying. We actually launched our business in China in 2020. That was great because we were able to bring some revenue to keep us going. And I think number three is, just really make sure that we had great cost control, be disciplined around spending. So we're not overspending. We actually make sure that, the business was still growing at a sustainable pace. Those are the things that we did during COVID, really helped us. And I can tell you something, Andrew, those habits still helping us today. So we're able to still be disciplined around cash, still be disciplined around operation efficiency, so that it's actually making us a better company, better business.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Because I was going to ask, how do you actually embed those learnings, those new disciplines that you otherwise probably wouldn't have actually really needed to focus on into how you run the business today? And it clearly has set you up, for the expansion that you're going through today.
100%. We apply those principles in everything that we do, whether it's product development or global expansion, or whether it's in hiring a team. We are not big believer of growing at all cost. We want to make sure that we can build a company that will last a decade, 2 decades, even 100 years. So we want to make sure the business is making a profit, being a sustainable business, rather than, okay, we're hitting $100 million revenue, but we're making huge loss. That's not the business we want to operate in. We want to make sure that we have enough margin to keep us innovating and growing, so that we can produce better products for our customers.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll, thinking about how you talk about innovating the business, at Australia Post as well. If you look at, the Australia Post, the modernisation and the transformation journey that we're going on at the moment, we really think about reliability, simplicity, and choice in all the aspects when we think about the customer value proposition. I'm really interested to understand more as far as how everybody on the July team is really a part of the flow of customer feedback to understand what those needs are.
Yeah.
And then thinking about, how rich that customer feedback is in nearly real time. How have you seen customer demands change?
Yeah.
And how are you applying that to July Luggage?
For sure. Actually, just on that point, I think the big change post-COVID, what we discovered is that people have been shifting their preference on how they shop. In the past, everything was online. I think 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, everyone was talking about, retail is dead. Everything is going online. But what we noticed post-COVID is that people actually want to have that physical experience. People want to come to the store. People want to touch and feel. People want to speak to a real person. And since then, we've actually been strengthening our retail footprint. Till this point, we have 8 or 9 retail stores across Australia. We're opening more for the next 12 months. We believe we need to be at where customers are at. If they want to shop in a retail store, we'll be there. If they want to shop online, we will provide the best online experience for our customers. And all this feedback is from, continuous survey, customer insights, through our online ticketing system, customer phone call, and people coming to the store. They tell us how much they love, online experience or retail experience. And I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, fantastic. And look, I think, at Australia Post, that's been at the forefront. I spoke about simplicity, reliability and choice. And in launching our new product, Metro, and ensuring that guarantee of next day delivery service has really been a part of making sure you can actually service your customers in the way that they want to be serviced. Mm-hmm. You mentioned about the app and tracking in the app. Yeah. What we've found, especially over this period of time, is that the trust and reliability of using the app, when you see so many scams taking place across text messages and so on, it really is a valuable tool where you can actually communicate, with your customers as well in a secure way.
Yeah, if there's one thing I can add, Andrew, is that I also noticed Australia Post have been very, very proactive with communication. Because, I think, was it last year or the year before, there was delay in WA. So I remember Australia Post sent a big email to all the business owners telling everyone, hey, expect delay in WA, make sure you tell your customers. We were able to let our customer know that there will be 3 to 4 business days of delay so people can lower the expectation. People always have a good experience. So it's up to them whether they want to take the service or not, rather than we over-promise and under-deliver, which is something I've noticed.
Yeah, and we through our sort of customer experience sort of transformation that we're going through at the moment, we're making significant investments, not only in the network, but in our technology areas. And the idea is that we can actually proactively inform you in as real near time of any delays in the network or any impacts that may or may not, be affecting, parcels getting to your customers.
For sure.
So we're really doubling down on that, and you will be excited to get your feedback as to how that's helping with that customer experience.
I'll make sure I let you know.
Yeah, good. And look, as you scale internationally, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've been facing into, and how's July Luggage, addressing that?
For sure. I think July, from day one, we knew that we wanted to go global. We probably expanded to international markets sooner than most of other brands. So we faced a lot of challenges early days, and we knew, we learned very quickly what those challenges are. And of course, we'll quickly address those challenges. I think the first one is obviously on the compliance side. Setting up the company, making sure that we're paying tax correctly, making sure that we're hiring people correctly. Those are I think, number one. I think number two is adapting into the local culture and local business environment. Something that works in Australia doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work in the US market. The way that we talk, even spelling can be a little bit different. The images that resonate with people is different. You gotta learn, you gotta adapt, and you got to improve. And those are things we're learning, as we are, continue growing in the overseas market. You cannot use the same thing, for that's already working in Australia, expecting working the same way in another market. It may work, but not always. So those are things that you got to be very flexible and agile. If it doesn't work, you change.
So I think the key word there is that you mentioned is being agile.
Correct.
When we spoke about agility in business, so applying those lessons that you've learned since launching in 2019 are really critical for people to learn from.
For sure. The other thing I just want to add for international market is that, Australia is a relatively small country in terms of population. In comparison to a market like the US, much, much larger, I think, 5 to 10 times of the population or market size. So even when it comes to logistics and operation, you got to treat it very differently.
And thinking, you spoke about that customer experience and so on. As you expand into new global markets, how do you ensure that you make that your brand promise is consistent across each of those?
Yeah, I think For us, there are two things very important, and those are the fundamental to our brand. The first one is making sure that we are supplying high quality products, that high quality design that resonate with people, and people love a product, they'll tell their family and friends, so more and more people will know about us. The second thing is really make sure that you deliver the same level of service in those markets. For example, for US market, at the beginning, we were using the same, same customer service people from Australia, but the issue with that is people constantly need to wait for like 12 hours or 15 hours, for a response because of the time difference. What we have done since then is we implemented AI into our ticketing system so that a lot of the answers can be responded, within seconds. Second thing is, we hire local agents so that they can address the issues and customer service issues, within a couple hours to deliver the best experience possible. So it's all about being consistent in your quality, product offering, and also service.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you. The adoption of tech, the power of AI, as long as you get it right, can be so powerful to delivering a consistent brand experience and addressing, customer queries first time before it's got to come through to to someone to actually answer. But then having that local knowledge, as you talk about, I think is really important because they understand the local market, they understand those customer
needs. Yeah, they understand how to deal with customer issues from a local perspective.
Yeah, really important.
Yeah.
And with peak planning well and truly underway across Australian businesses, it'll be fantastic to understand how you're planning peak and how peak impacts your business.
For sure. As you mentioned, Andrew, peak season just around the corner, and a lot of businesses, including ourselves, will see double or triple of the sales, comparing to off-peak season. So there's a lot of preparation work that need to be done in order to fulfill customer demands. I think for us, what we have done for the past couple of years is that we have become more data-driven. So that we can actually forecast what customer needs, and so we're bringing stock in as what we planned. I think to make sure that our inventory is more efficient. So we're not bringing a lot of stock in, hoping that it will sell. I think that's number one. Number two is what we've done very differently from other businesses, that we have been leveraging upstream DC, where we keep a lot of our stock, at our factories or at a warehouse in Asia, so that we have the stock ready to go. We don't have to wait for fresh production that will take 2 or 3 months. Whereas if I have the stock ready to go, it will only take about 3 weeks for me to get stock over to Australia and fulfill to customers. And those are the very, very important things for inventory. And on the customer service side, we want to make sure that we have enough people to answer those tickets as peak season coming, and so that we can deliver the best experience for our customers. On top of that, we're ramping up our marketing activities as well to make sure that people know about us, know that some of the new ranges we're releasing, and make sure that people, when people, make sure that July is top of their mind, when they think about travel, when they think about luggage.
So, Richard, it's been amazing having you here today, and I really want to thank you for sharing your knowledge around agility, customer experience, expanding into new markets, and preparing for peak, such a busy time of the year for the Australian retail sector.
I had a lot of fun chatting to you today, and I look forward to chatting to you more. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Andrew and Richard. It was fascinating to hear about a business that started just before COVID arrived and how it had to innovate and pivot to get through those difficult few years and not just survive, but thrive. And the other takeaway for me was how Richard and his team have embedded those habits developed through COVID and how they are still helping the business today. Of course, there is no singular model when it comes to our customers, and I would now like to introduce an emerging small business who, like July Luggage, is breaking into overseas markets, but whose offering and approach is very different. This business started in 2021 in the middle of a global pandemic. Karina Barker is founder and creative director of sustainable fashion brand Re'lax Remade, and I can't wait to hear her story. Thanks for joining us, Karina.
Thanks so much for having me, Gary.
Now, let's just start with what the business is all about. So tell me about Re'lax Remade. How did it start? How did you get the idea? And tell us a bit about how that all started.
Well, we make hats and now jackets from vintage towels, and our offering is really luxurious and high-end and meticulously made. But the inspiration was really much more lowbrow. It was my dad's little terry-toweling bucket hat from the 70s. So all my childhood memories and most of my childhood photos, he's in this hat. And during lockdown, we all had time on our hands and all we were able to do was walk. So everyone was wearing hats. And I've always collected and used vintage homewares at home. And I had a beautiful collection of vintage towels. And just one day I thought, wow, these towels really remind me of my dad's hat, which is now, worn to threads. So I made him one. That was really reminiscent of the original, a floral one, and I kept making them and I started posting them on Instagram and people really responded. People were excited about being able to buy a product that was new and exciting but very responsible and only using existing materials, and the response has been amazing.
I can see one there on the chair. You got to hold it up.
This is my personal one.
So you're very well colour coordinated.
And this is our new jacket and rosettes. So it's interesting, most of the towels that we use were kept for good in grandma's cupboard or mum's linen cupboard, and this towel was from the 30s, so it's nearly 100 years old, but
Wow.
But when I sourced it, it hadn't even ever been washed, let alone used. So it's really exciting to me to give a new life to these old products, which people wouldn't use it for a towel anymore because they're tiny and not as luxurious as the towels you buy these days, but otherwise it would become a rag. What do you do with an old towel? So the design and the vintage colorways and the vintage designs are all so stunning that we're really having fun transforming them into more valuable pieces.
Now, you mentioned sourcing, so you must have run out of your own towels at some point. So how do you source? And
it's a huge part of
what's
the
the
job.
motivation for me to hand over a vintage towel?
Yeah, it's all really personal, isn't it? And I think also that's part of why the product resonates, because it is so personal and people are excited to give me their towels that was in their grandmother's beach house or something like that. So I built up a lot of relationships with vintage dealers who spend their life scouring estate sales and stuff, and now they come to me directly and offer them to me. And also just eBay, a lot of time spent on eBay. When I started the business, my youngest kid was only 3, so there wasn't very much sleep going on, and there was a lot of midnight eBay sourcing and Facebook groups, Instagram sellers, that sort of thing. But it's very particular and nuanced, and I now have a wealth of knowledge in this niche area of vintage towels, because a lot of them have different piles and different weaves and different details, and so I know what to look for now.
And you started, obviously you made that first one for your dad, but you must have a team if you're making them, and I'm looking at your website, there's lots on there. You must have a team and have taught them how does that all work?
So I started at home in one room, which I was sharing with my husband who was working from home in the pandemic. And for about 18 months I did it all myself, the cutting and sewing and everything. And then we really had such a positive response, and a lot of influential people in the fashion world really got behind us. Like the We Wear Australian people were amazing at telling us that they believed in our product and that they wanted to help us amplify what we were doing. And so we really took a leap of faith and moved into a factory unit. My husband joined the business, and now there's 10 of us.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really special. And we work really hard to be a good, ethical place to work, because I think with sustainability, people are often thinking about the environment, but labour and the people that are making the clothes is such an essential part of being sustainable, because even fast fashion is handmade. It's all handmade, but we we want our people to bring themselves to work. They've all got amazing, unique gifts to offer. And we close on a Wednesday because it is a really physically labour-intensive process making things, and we want people to have a break and stay healthy. And so we put a lot of effort into being ethical in that way as well.
That's wonderful. So I know often people go straight to environment with
Yeah,
sustainability, but
exactly.
it's a lot more when we talk about modern slavery and bringing your whole selves to work. Just on that sustainability bit though, so you started obviously using towels that existed, so you weren't making things from scratch,
we don't
and
make
they're
any
vintage.
new.
You're not going to, they're not inexpensive, so you're going to keep them, and they're a bit of a collector's item.
Exactly.
But what about your customer then? How important does that environment, does that credential matter versus the product in your mind?
I like to think they're beautiful enough that even without an environmental conscience, people would still want the hats. But I think a lot of our customers, they love fashion and they're motivated by fashion, and they want to put their money behind something that has a positive impact. So what we're trying to do is create a product that is elevated and up there with any fashion item that you can find worldwide, but comes with this great feeling of doing the right thing, supporting local artisans, supporting the environment, also nostalgic memories. Like it feels like a really personal product, and definitely sustainability is that's the underlying premise of our whole business. And I think our customers are looking for it. Absolutely.
So how do you position that then with you? So how do you position, they're beautiful to start with, but how do you then position that sustainability? And there's a particular demo.
I think
what's the demographic that buys this your product?
I've never wanted to overtly educate people on the environmental impacts of fashion. Thankfully, I think that's becoming a lot more mainstream to be aware of it now. But really just leading by example and being really open about what we do and really transparent. And social media plays a part in that because we can really show how we make things and the process. Like every hat takes at least 8 hours to make, and a lot of it is hand done. And I think having that transparency helps people to feel connected to the brand and trust in us. And so, demographically, we cover the whole age spectrum, and often people, probably our biggest buyers are slightly older, but they might buy them for their children. There's a lot of people that end up about half of our customers each time we release a collection are return customers, which is really nice because we know that the product's obviously holding up and they want to come back and share the experience with their families. A lot of people have multi-generational photos that they send in to us of 3 generations wearing the Re'lax Remade hat. So yeah, it covers a lot of bases.
Now, just turning to how you get product to your customers. So obviously delivery is important. You started a lot of stories I hear about starting from scratch and lodging at the post office. But what's your story around that, and how important is that end-to-end delivery for you?
Yeah, essential. It's really important to us that the packages arrive still looking like they've just left our factory, which they do with Australia Post. And we package our hats in boxes so that they are structured. They can be flattened, but we like it to arrive looking like a brand new,
pristine condition.
Yeah, exactly. So it needs to be reliable and no surprises and really good tracking. And also just at the local level, we always take our packages to the local post office and talk to the guy at the counter, and they've been amazing at educating us on the most cost-effective way to do it, and even getting things like packing tape that is recycled and things like that. Like there's a lot of we're trying to be conscious at every level, and working with the local post office on that is really valuable. And in fact, when it was just me working from home, there was one guy at the local post office, Daryl, who taught me everything. And I used to handwrite all the labels and take them into him, and he'd help me choose the right packaging.
I hope you're printing them now.
I am printing them now, yeah. My husband does that.
There's more accurate, they're clearly handwritten. we get through the system, but printed is better.
Yeah.
And what about things like return? I assume you don't get many returns having looked at the product, but if there's if there's fraying or damage or you need to repair, what happens with that?
Yeah, well, we actually have a lifetime mending guarantee, which is a really exciting part of the business, I think, so that the product doesn't, once it leaves the factory, it's still part of our ecosystem and our responsibility. And if there is any problems, or even if you've just worn it to death and it's full of seawater, you can send it back in and we'll wash it and steam it and fluff it back up and structure it again. And so postage back and forth and that kind of open communication is really integral to our business.
And I guess that point about sending it back, like rather than ending up in landfill or thrown out, you'd prefer to repair it and
100%.
get reused from it.
Yeah, really important. And because we have so many different styles now, I think there's definitely opportunity for us to have a secondhand market. We're looking into that. So people might want to send back a hat and try a different style and try that. I think people often want to try them all. So I think having a secondhand or a buyback or some kind of system where we can bring them back and send them back out again is really important. That's an exciting thing we're looking into at the moment.
Now, tell me, I mean, you started in the middle of COVID, so there would have been just challenge. I guess, unlike Richard, who Andrew spoke to starting just before COVID in the luggage industry, not a great time to start, you started knowing that there was a pandemic. But did you think about, was it focused on Australian? Did you think about where the consumer lived, or did you just have a global sort of view of?
I think I saw it as a really quintessentially Australian product. But from the very beginning, we've had a lot of international interest, which was surprising to me, but exciting. I think it was an idea that people hadn't seen before, and some of our first collections we sold the whole collection to a boutique in London and another collection to Switzerland. And luckily for us at the time, the exchange rate meant that they were paying full price and able to mark it up on their end. So that was really exciting. And people love Australia, Sending overseas is really accessible now. Things only take about 5 days to get to the other side of the world. And so it's really opened up. The hats are going all over the world.
Right, that must be so exciting.
Yeah, it's really exciting.
And any sort of extra barriers with moving stuff overseas that you found? Exchange rate, customs, duty, that sort of thing?
Yeah, the Australian dollar is not the best, but and we have had some problems with customs, but my husband's got that totally sorted out now and they fly straight through. But it's all about getting the right information and ticking the right boxes so things move swiftly through the process. But yeah, I think people are often nervous because we're in Australia and it's on the other side of the world to a lot of things. But because of the tracking being so reliable and our business being very open on social media, I think people have a trust. And we have had people buy in London and then 3 days later they've got their hat, so they've come back and bought a second one straight away because it's been much easier than they realised.
The world has definitely got smaller in terms of moving things around. And how do you market? So in terms of, you mentioned selling it to stores around the world, but are there particular markets where you think they're more beach going or they're more likely to wear hats, there's more sun?
We're really interested to talk to places like Liberties in London, places that have really luxurious artisanal sort of products. But certainly we've been approached by a lot of boutique hotels that are on the shore but are not, they're still luxurious, but by the beach. I think there's opportunity everywhere, but I don't see them just as beach hats. I see them also as city hats, and a lot of them are this one is just a bucket hat, but a lot of our styles are a lot more elevated and like high end.
Right.
Yeah.
And so how do you market? Is it through influencers?
It's all Instagram.
It is all Instagram.
So honestly, we haven't put any extra effort into marketing until a few weeks ago when we hired our first social media manager, which is exciting.
And sorry, can I just ask to interrupt, but what led you to why did you do that? Why did you hire someone now? Do you felt you're at the right point to do that?
Yeah, so we've spent a long time building up the product and making sure that our manufacturing is perfect, and we've got it, because each hat is one of a kind, you're coming up with different problems with each hat and each towel. You can't just cut a whole lot at once. Each towel's already lived its own life. It needs to be treated in its own individual way. So the training is quite intensive, and we've spent a lot of time making sure that the product is exactly perfect. And now that we know we can deliver that, and as fast as slow fashion can be, which is still slow, but as fast as we can keep it so that the value is really strong, then we felt ready to openly, overtly market.
Right.
But otherwise, we've just been putting it on Instagram and really putting ourselves out there, putting our values on display so that the right people find us.
And I guess you don't want to mass produce. I mean, by definition.
Exactly. Yeah,
It's
exactly.
not fast.
Yeah, exactly. It's growing at just the right pace now that we have a team of 10. When I was at home, just me, it was growing too quickly and it was really stressful, which is obviously a good problem to have. But now that there's 10 of us and everyone's excellent at their job and we're really like a well-oiled machine, and now we're ready for being able to offer a lot more hats, being able to offer them wholesale, things like that. But it's been a long runway to get there.
Right. Well, that's great. Now, you mentioned We Wear Australian a bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be small fashion houses out there listening today that won't be aware of We Wear Australian, what it means. So just tell us a bit about it and why you joined. What has it done for you?
It's a beautiful initiative that is about kind of umbrellaing and nurturing small independent Australian designers and together amplifying their voice in a way that is, on par with all the beautiful fashion coming out of Paris and everywhere else. The way that they present us, the way that the We Wear Australian campaign presents these independent Australian designers really puts them out there on a world stage, puts them in front of the right eyes and really elevates the products and amplifies the voices, and it's a real collaborative kind of effort.
I saw some of the videos from a campaign
they're
earlier this year or last year, and they're just
Yeah.
in Northern Territory, far north Queensland, so beautiful parts of it, very Australian,
Yes.
but really sort of trying to, brand Australia is very is a good brand around the world.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Now, I just I know there'll be lots of people out there who will be interested in any advice you have around starting from scratch, anything that you can think of that you've learned along the journey that you'd impart.
I think asking for help and really figuring out the parts of your business that you're not confident in and looking for people that can help you with that area. We've worked with a mentor called the Fashion Advocate. She's amazing and she's really given us fantastic advice. We've worked with Kelly from We Wear Australian, and she gives incredible industry-specific advice and support. And so really looking for the people that are on your wavelength and that can offer you strategies that don't come naturally to your personal skill set.
Well, it's important to know what you're good at and where you need help.
Yeah.
And fast forward 5 years, where is Re'lax Remade?
I think we're in Liberties and we're in department stores in Europe, and hopefully still in our beautiful little colourful factory in Belrose with our little team. I don't think we want to grow too big because I think the product is so personal. That's not really what it's about, but we want to obviously make enough that we can keep everyone employed and keep the products at a great level of quality. So I think just getting them out there and having more customers aware of the value of handmade goods. Well, all goods are handmade, but the value that, like the true cost of what it takes to make an item, and having consumers that really understand and want to put their buying power behind that.
And my last question, from a sourcing perspective, I mean, there are, I don't know how many people, hundreds of people listening today, are you looking for more?
Absolutely. Message me with your towels, please. The era that I love the best is around 60s, 70s or earlier. But please do. I would love to see anyone's linen cupboards.
Well, I'll have a look when I get home tonight.
You.
Well, look, Karina, thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing your personal business journey.
Thanks,
I'm going to continue to watch with interest as your business continues to grow and flourish. And, best of luck as the business grows.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Gary.
Now, thank you all for joining us today. If you have a moment, please do send through your thoughts by completing the survey that you can access in your dashboard. And do keep an eye out for the next Business Talks webinar. And in the meantime, make sure you download the sneak peek of our Australia Post Peak Playbook via your console to give you tips and tricks to succeed this peak period. Thanks for joining.